This video is going to cover how China works as a state. If you would like to have further context on the background of Chinese civilization, I highly recommend checking out my first video in the series, which is going to be linked below. Now, let's continue. The People's Republic of China, in sharp contrast to the West, as well as many wealthy East Asian nations like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, is authoritarian. This authoritarian system of governance can be broken down into three sectors: the state, which manages the bureaucracy and administration, the military, which manages defense, obviously, and then you have the centerpiece, the Chinese Communist Party. The center of the Chinese Communist Party is the Politburo, which manages the core affairs, dictating those of the rest of the party. There is also the National People's Congress, although calling it a Congress is rather a misnomer since it's basically a rubber stamp. There's also the State Council, which is broken down into several sectors, such as education, healthcare, sports, and pretty much anything else. Another overlooked administration is the quote-unquote organizational department. Yes, an organization named the Organizational Department. Bureaucrats are not particularly famed for their creativity. This is kind of like the Chinese Communist Party's Human Resources Brigade, picking up various people to run the government. The Chinese Communist Party also has its own set of regional secretaries that are oftentimes holding more power than the actual regional people themselves, let alone their representatives. The military command is under the Central Military Commission, which is run by, you guessed it, the Chinese Communist Party. As you can tell, the Chinese Communist Party pretty much runs the show. From now on, I'm just going to be calling it the CCP since it's shorter. Anyway, the head of the CCP as of the making of this video is Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has done away with many of the term limits that were set on previous leaders of the party, which pretty much makes him the de facto leader for life, which is rather unusual in the post-Mao era. He kind of operates as a sort of godlike king. And speaking of godlike kings, the CCP subscribes to a state atheism on a de facto level, oftentimes repressing various indigenous religions like Confucianism and Taoism, along with foreign religions like Christianity and especially Islam. There has also been widespread oppression of new cults like the Falun Gong. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, state atheism pretty much faded to the wayside as new religious movements popped up in the country so long as they didn't challenge the party's authority. As a result of this, Christianity has seen a resurgence as many people were seeking meaning in alternative routes, and some have also sought meaning in traditional routes. However, there have been some bumps along the road, most notably the suppression of the aforementioned Falun Gong cult and Muslim Uyghurs in particular. The Uyghurs are a Turkic-speaking people group in northwest China, and they practice Islam. They've been heavily repressed in recent years. The CCP has tried to destroy their culture, not only through the use of certain camps, but also by putting more Han Chinese people into the region. This has even gone to the point of the Chinese government building railway networks from eastern China, where most of the Han Chinese live, into western portions of the country. The same thing has happened to some degree in Tibet. China's human rights record has oftentimes put itself at loggerheads with the West and its allies over issues like censorship, lack of democracy, and the treatment of ethnic minorities. However, China oftentimes is quick to point out that the West oftentimes supports countries with less than stellar human rights records like Saudi Arabia. And while this is indeed a whataboutism fallacy, it can be oftentimes an effective rhetorical device. While human rights is a key component, it does tend to take a backtrack when compared to economic concerns and national security concerns, which by and large are far more important in China's relationship with the West and the rest of the democratic world. It is likely that in remote areas like Xinjiang or Tibet, China will continue to populate these regions with more Han Chinese people, thereby outpopulating the indigenous groups, further resulting in more subjugation and perhaps the destruction of those indigenous cultures. Another serious source of contention is Hong Kong, which was won by the British during the highly controversial Opium Wars during the 1800s. Hong Kong, nonetheless, developed a quasi-liberal democracy with infinitely more freedom and wealth than what was found on mainland China at the time. However, in 1999, the UK handed Hong Kong over to mainland China, and Portugal handed over Macau. This led to a massive culture shock, and many Chinese in Hong Kong fled to countries like Australia and Canada, fearing the CCP's rule. And it turns out they were by and large correct. Over the course of less than a few decades, the CCP has asserted its authority and engaged in censorship. They've also engaged in fugitive practices that would stomp out democratic protests on the series of islands. This has led to a resurgence of more protests in Hong Kong against the CCP and its policies. This is highly unlikely to be an easy issue when it comes to subjugating a group of people that are educated, unlike, say, that of the Uyghurs or the Tibetans. The reason being is that you're dealing with a part of the world that was once extremely economically prosperous and is also predominantly Han Chinese. Another source of contention is Taiwan. Taiwan is essentially a product of the aftermath of the Chinese Civil War. When the Japanese were kicked out after World War II, the communists and the nationalists went back to fighting each other. The nationalists were defeated and fled to the island of Taiwan, also known as the Republic of China. And while it first started off as a military dictatorship, Taiwan eventually transformed into a very prosperous democracy during the 80s and 90s, focusing on the manufacturing of semiconductors. Taiwan actually had a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. However, under the influence of various nations of the developing world, the People's Republic of China eventually asserted itself, much to the disgruntlement of the West, and took that spot on the Security Council. Eventually, the West, under the pressure of mainland China, had to give up its formal relationships with Taiwan. However, they do maintain close bonds nonetheless. To this day, both China, the People's Republic of China, as well as the Republic of China, claim to be the one true China. And this issue continues to get kicked down the road and may escalate in a full-fledged war, which possibly could escalate into World War III. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's focus on the Chinese economy. While starting off as a centralized economy under communism, or more accurately socialism during the Maoist era, when Mao died and Deng Xiaoping, a pragmatist control, the country eventually tended towards a sort of quasi-capitalist economy. However, with that being said, many of the businesses are still by and large deeply interconnected with the Chinese Communist Party, be that when it comes to oil, telecommunications, and minerals. The Chinese economic system doesn't really fit into any sort of ism. It's kind of like capitalism, but also kind of like socialism, and perhaps the best way to describe it is state capitalism. Nonetheless, in spite of all of its flaws of the system, it has had a tremendous amount of people come out of poverty. For all the human rights abuses, China's autocratic system has led to a certain degree of checks and balances, which has made the country remarkably successful in building very impressive infrastructure projects such as roads, bridges, and high-speed rail, that would make many Western countries gawk at jealousy. However, much of this growth has been based off of heavy fossil fuels like coal, which has resulted in environmental catastrophes around the country, particularly in major cities like Beijing, where the air quality is absolute garbage. Nonetheless, the authoritarian control has allowed China to invest in a lot of green technology, which has assuaged the situation to some degree. Speaking of technology, cities like Shenzhen, a former fishing village, have now become major trade outposts. The city is also a major sector in manufacturing of electronic goods. The Chinese Communist Party has also heavily subsidized corporations that are within their control. The most notable is Huawei, which is a very powerful telecommunications company which, due to its subsidization, invests a great deal in 5G networks. The most important sector of the economy is, of course, trade. China is the most important trading partner for most countries around the world, outbeating the US, European Union, and Japan. They are a massive manufacturing giant and export an insane number of products. Many people have believed that China entering the World Trade Organization in 2001 would lessen their autocratic system, but this has proven not to be the case. However, it has expanded Chinese economic power around the globe. China is also notorious for manipulating its currency by buying foreign reserves to artificially deflate its own currency to make exports cheaper. This has infuriated various nations who are mad that their homegrown products cannot compete with cheap Chinese imports. On the other hand, China's major export-led economy is oftentimes a symptom of the fact that despite all the people being pushed out of poverty, their own poverty line was pretty low to begin with. Many Chinese people have a hard time buying luxury products, and many of them prefer to invest in real estate or just save in the long term. While China has been quite successful in building infrastructure, it has not been particularly good for most forms of innovation, although that is certainly changing, especially when it comes to AI. One major issue of concern is that of intellectual property, as China is notorious for the theft of various creative projects, such as Italian fashion knockoffs, Japanese video games, and American tech patents. This has infuriated many countries in the developed world, which see China as a sort of copycat, incapable of producing its own technological advancements and creative output without the help of the developed world. This will be a critical factor as to whether or not China can truly become a developed country or fall into the middle income trap. It is very clear that many of the Asian tigers, like South Korea, have escaped the middle income trap, but whether China can do so is another matter. Part of the issue with innovation and creativity is China's digital isolation. China is one of four countries, along with a great company like Iran, formerly Syria, and North Korea, which banned Facebook. Chinese people don't have access to Google or YouTube unless it's through a certain VPN, which they can use to bypass what is called the Great Firewall of China. Instead, Chinese people have their own set of alternative social media platforms, which are far easier for the Chinese Communist Party to control, censor, and manipulate. However, this is done at the cost of restricting Chinese people's access to various ideas from around the world. This could result in a digital bipolar world, with most of the West using American digital infrastructure, while at the same time, China having a handful of countries under its belt, such as sub Saharan African nations, developing their own infrastructure reliant on Chinese services. And there you have it. That's the breakdown of China's economy and political system, and how the country, generally speaking, works. Obviously, this is only scratching the surface and provides the most rudimentary understanding of a universe of complexity. In my following video, I'm going to be going over China's foreign relationships and its potential to be a world superpower. Thanks for watching.